Late, very late on a Thursday, I booted up the HBO Max app, found the Class Action Park documentary, and played it. Something like 2 or 3 minutes after it became available to the world, and for the first time, I got to watch a 90-minute documentary on Action Park. That was the final moment in a 10-year saga of a project that was floating in the back of my life and that I'm really happy turned out with something so wonderful. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Daniel Boyd, Peter Healy, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. I went to Action Park when I was about 11 years old. My father took his kids there, and we went around, did some of the rides, and I have extremely strong memories when I would first see some of these rides. My reaction, almost every single time, was, "No way am I going on this." I'd been to other theme parks and other amusement parks, even weird, janky circus amusement parks, but nothing filled me with as much fear as looking at Action Park rides. I remember looking at the wave pool for the first time, and my very first thought, the thought of a kid, was, "No way is that safe." The first time you saw people going up and down to such levels in the wave pool told you instinctually that this thing was ridiculously dangerous. I did not go on that many rides, and most of my time I spent observing what was going on. I never forgot Action Park, and sometime after I finished production on Get Lamp, I started to think about, would it be possible to do a documentary on Action Park and what it meant, and perhaps even more importantly, the ramifications of what such a place existing represented. Now, at the time, I was also working on what would become the 3 canceled documentaries. So those were all backwards-looking technological histories with a huge human element. The Action Park documentary I started to form in my mind started to become something more of an essay on the human condition and what such a park represented. I mean, I knew it would be interesting to show footage of these crazy rides and these unusual buildings and structures, but I wanted it to be about what we were and what we represented and what the existence of such a place really meant. Let's step back a little bit. If you've never heard of Action Park, it was an amusement park in New Jersey that existed for decades and had some of the wildest, weirdly designed rides you would ever see. No other park in the United States had what Action Park had. There were incredibly poorly tested rides, and folks were getting hurt there at the rate of hundreds, and I'm not kidding, hundreds of people a day. Folks would get burns on concrete. They would get smacked into the sides of rides. People would get into fights and drunken revelry and completely unregulated, truly unregulated rides. There are so many people who passed through Action Park, and they have memories, wonderful, beautiful memories of summers past. And then there are people for whom Action Park is an incredible, terrible tragedy in their lives, the difference between happiness and despair. The park existed for years and years and years, and everybody who went there knew that, to some extent, it was extremely unsafe. What they didn't know was that it was truly unsafe, dangerously, perhaps illegally unsafe, and a lot of folks, besides getting hurt, also experienced traumas and, in some cases, death that affected those families, obviously, to the present day. I saw in there the bones of a documentary that would juxtapose both the joy people felt when they went to Action Park and the tragedy of the families who experienced the horrors of those same rides. I worked on that documentary for about 2 years, gathering some research, bringing in a few folks to help me find clippings and references, and trying to come up with what are the themes and the meaning of Action Park. But ultimately, I decided it wasn't something I had the energy or time for. And unfortunately, like a lot of projects that stall, I just had to put it away. But I never stopped thinking about the potential for such a documentary. Over time, documentaries and short films on YouTube and other locations started to come up. There was one from an episode of Defunct Land, and there were a few other weird New Jersey life-like documentaries that mentioned Action Park or went into how weird it was. So in some ways, I thought, well, at least the subject is being covered in somebody's idea, but it won't be the overarching commentary on the human condition that I wanted. That's the way life goes. Years and years later, I'm in a coffee shop called Tracks with a journalist and filmmaker who had done some films, and we were sharing stories and ideas. In some ways, he was interviewing me, just trying to scoop up some background information and seeing what Internet Archive might have in terms of research material. And we kind of drifted into other subjects that we thought of, and somewhere in there, I mentioned Action Park, and he said, "Oh, I'm doing a documentary on Action Park." And we started to share our stories. And what I remember the most was I was really proud of some of the things that I had dug up with my fellow researchers. We were digging really deep, we thought, but Seth had it way better than I did. I would come up with a germ of an idea we found, and he would tell me the names, the dates. He knew what was going on with Action Park. He had traced connections with Wall Street, the Mafia, many other parties with Action Park that I hadn't even begun to find. So I dumped everything that I had with him, all of my information, and we basically left it at that. A few months later, he told me that an opportunity had come up where they were going to start filming interviews for the Action Park documentary, and would I be interested? And that's how I found myself in September 2019 being interviewed in a hotel about Action Park. Besides my own thoughts and descriptions of what I remembered, they also showed me research that they had done similar to what I had found, and giving me names and details that I could talk about on screen. We recorded for about 40 minutes, and in an indication of what you have to go through sometimes in life and nobody ever knows about it, there were renovations going on to the hotel. We were filming in the early afternoon, and they were using pile drivers in other rooms to break apart concrete and fix things up. So every once in a while, I'd be giving a pretty good statement, and then this pile driver would echo through the building, and we had to stop. Somehow, through all that, we got a few really good answers, some good minutes of footage. Seth thanked me, and I went on with my life. I think this is important to note. My complete contribution to this documentary totals maybe 2 hours of work, of doing the interview and the conversation I had with Seth, and nothing else. No other writing or descriptions or information, certainly not editing, directing, filming. Nothing. But I was so happy that Seth had given me an opportunity to play some part in there. Months went by, and I knew they were working on it and that they hoped to have something done soon. And then I heard from them that some service had purchased their documentary. I think it's important to note that once they got that contract, they kept editing. They brought in a few more people, they gathered more information, and when the first trailer came out, people started to send them even more footage, even more photographs that they wouldn't have ever had a chance to get looking around on their own. So they kept editing. They kept adding this footage and photography into the documentary. And different filmmakers have different approaches to showing early cuts to people. From my own perspective, I will have very limited friends and family screenings of films to see the reaction, to feel the emotions in the room, to see if things are going where I thought they were. When you do that, it's kind of interesting because things that you thought were perfect in terms of timing and tone will come off as too slow or too callous or maybe some sort of mixture of emotions you didn't intend. I've had people laugh at places I didn't want them to or fall into some sort of spoken criticism because they're paying too much attention to something on the wall or a phrase someone used, just the natural gap between what we think of what we do and what others do. In the case of some filmmakers, they keep everybody in the dark until it comes out. And so I never saw a frame of the final film before the rest of the world did. That's why, at such a late hour on a Thursday, I was watching Class Action Park for the first time. Naturally, I'm first obsessed with seeing what of my lines got into the final. And I'd say I've got about a minute and a half out of 90 minutes of screen time. I'm used just where they need me. They'd added John Hodgman as a narrator, and his tone was perfect, a neutral statement of horrors and insights into the Action Park story. They also had a number of other interviewees who were just sizzling, New Jersey natives who had either worked at or gone to the park, giving this kind of incredulous view of this major part of their childhood. And the footage was so much more than I thought I would ever see of Action Park. There's a slide in Action Park called the Cannonball Loop, and it is an actual loop-de-loop that was dangerous and terribly designed, and there were only one or two beloved photographs of this thing, but they had since recovered minutes and minutes of footage of it being used, of people being near it, and all sorts of angles, and it made it so much better to tell that legend. I'm not going to fill your time with a review of everything that's in Class Action Park. Just needless to say, it was maybe 90% of what I was going for when I was working on my documentary about it, and they went 10% in directions I never would have gone and which they really captured. The biggest difference, I think, between what I would have done and what they did is that I saw a metaphor in Action Park to the nature of being alive, of being a human. The Action Park gave you so much freedom. And for people who went there, they felt the happiness of that freedom, being able to do whatever they want and feeling like they were completely in control. But for others, for the families, for the folks affected by it, who literally lost close relatives to these rides, who literally had them get electrocuted, drowned, paralyzed from these rides. It was, in many ways, the worst part of us. They instead moved it in the direction of the control that was required by the owner, Gene Mulvihill, and the fraud and lies and tricks that were done to keep this park going, even in the face of many lawsuits, of government intervention, of a whole range of forces trying to shut this park down or at least try to make it safe, and his tireless effort over 20 years to ensure that the party would never, ever end. I totally agree with this direction. What's really been nice about reading the reviews and the social media reaction to Class Action Park has been how many people are hit with the whiplash that the movie so beautifully captures, the idea of these crazy rides that could have never existed elsewhere, followed by actual stories of death and injury and the long-lasting effects on families that it had. Many people are completely utterly bewildered and mixed up by watching that happen. But that, to me, was the very nature of Action Park. So that movie is out there. Like many documentaries about a subject in the past, it's a lot of talking heads over a lot of archival footage. But I think the filmmakers spectacularly captured the dichotomy between what we want and what we get, and about freedom versus injury and danger, and trying to strike a balance between giving people the opportunity to do great and weird things and dealing with the consequences. And for myself, there's the pleasure of knowing that I was right, that the idea was good. There was a real solid documentary idea there. And even though my life didn't let me do it, it's good to know, as I'm watching what would have been something I had done come to fruition under other hands, extremely competent hands, and become the effect on the world that I had really hoped my own film would be. That's probably the best film review I can give anything. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, thanks to Emilio Oliveira, Scott Roseanne, Scott McGrady, Mark Pilgrim, Wayne Arthurton, Forrest Fuqua, and James Bekoyanu, along with hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. Their slogan was so accurate. There's nothing in the world like Action Park.